The rain drummed softly against my kitchen window, a mournful rhythm that seemed to mirror the hollow ache in my chest. I sat alone at the worn oak table, a single candle casting a frail glow across a chocolate cake I'd bought from the corner bakery. My name is Ruth, and I've always believed family is bound by love, a currency you offer freely expecting nothing but the warmth of connection in return. But on the night I turned 67, as voices drifted from my living room like sharp-edged shadows, I learned that some bonds are measured only in dollars and some debts of the heart are left unpaid. I'm a retired nurse widowed for 12 years since my Tom passed. He was a man whose steady presence made the world feel safe, like a harbor in a storm. Together we raised our daughter Ellen in this old house, with its sagging porch and creaky floors, a home we filled with dreams, laughter, and the smell of Sunday roasts. My life was spent mending broken things, patients in the hospital where I worked long shifts, then my family when life bruised them. When Tom died, I turned my heart fully to Ellen and her children, my grandchildren Lily and Max. I thought that's what you do as a mother, a grandmother. You give until you're empty, and you don't ask for praise. That birthday wasn't meant to be grand. I didn't expect banners or speeches, but I'd hoped for a flicker of warmth, a smile, a hug, maybe a moment where I wasn't just the woman who paid for their beach vacations or wrote checks for their new SUV. Ellen had called days earlier, her voice brisk, almost irritated. "We'll come for dinner, Mom, but don't go overboard. We're swamped." I didn't mind. I spent the day baking their favorite lemon cake, dusting off the good china white with gold rims, the set Tom and I bought for our 10th anniversary. I slipped into my favorite dress, a soft blue one Ellen once said, made my eyes look young, and I waited. They arrived an hour late, spilling through the door with complaints about traffic and deadlines. Ellen barely glanced at me, her fingers tapping her phone, her face lit by its cold glow. Lily, 15, and Max, 12, flopped onto the couch, their eyes locked on their screens, earbuds dangling. My son-in-law, Greg, offered a curt nod before heading to the liquor cabinet, pouring himself a glass from Tom's old whiskey bottle without asking. I tried to spark conversation, asked about school, their summer plans, Max's soccer games. But their answers were clipped, their eyes elsewhere, and the air felt thick, like I was a chore they were enduring. Dinner was quiet, the clink of forks louder than any laughter. I served the cake, hoping it might soften the mood, but Lily pushed it aside, muttering about calories. Max ate a bite, then scrolled through his phone. Ellen and Greg talked about their next renovation, their voices bright with plans I wasn't part of. I smiled, nodded, and swallowed the lump in my throat. When the plates were cleared, I excused myself to the kitchen, needing a moment to breathe. I didn't want them to see the tears burning my eyes. I was scrubbing a pan, the warm water soothing my trembling hands, when I heard Max's voice, sharp and careless, slicing through the hum of the house. "Why do we even bother coming here? Grandma's useless. She just sits around like she's waiting to kick the bucket." The pan slipped from my fingers, clattering into the sink. My breath caught, and I waited, praying Ellen would scold him, defend me, anything. But then came her laugh, low, dismissive, like a door slamming shut. "Max, don't be harsh. She's got money, though. That's worth something." The room spun. I gripped the counter, my knees buckling. Lily's voice joined in, laced with that teenage venom that cuts deeper than a knife. "Yeah, but she's so dull, always droning on about the past. Like, who cares about her old stories?" Greg chuckled a sound that twisted my stomach. Ellen said nothing, not a word to stand up for me. I stood frozen, the mother who'd rocked them through fevers paid for their piano lessons driven across town at midnight when Ellen's car broke down. The grandmother who'd tucked 20s into their pockets, baked cookies for their friends, and cheered at every school play. Useless, dull, a wallet with a heartbeat. I don't know how long I stayed there, the faucet running until my hands pruned. Their voices faded, replaced by the crunch of gravel as their car pulled away. No goodbyes, no thank yous, just the echo of their absence. The house fell silent. The candle on the table, a puddle of wax beside the untouched cake. I sank into a chair, staring at the crumbs, and felt something fracture inside me. Not just my heart, but the myth I'd clung to, that my family needed me, that my love was their foundation. I was wrong. They didn't need me. They needed my $2 million estate, the savings Tom and I had built the house I'd kept pristine for them. To them, I was a means to an end, nothing more. Morning came gray and heavy. I moved through the house like a ghost touching the relics of my life. Tom's leather armchair worn smooth by his hands, the photo albums I'd filled with Ellen's first steps, her graduation, her wedding, the quilt I'd stitched for Lily's crib, each square a prayer for her future. They felt like anchors chaining me to a version of myself that no longer existed. In the bathroom mirror, I studied my face lines carved by years of worry and joy, silver hair I'd stopped dyeing eyes that still held a spark, though dimmed. When had I become invisible? Not just to them, but to myself. I didn't cry, though. The urge sat heavy in my chest. Instead, I brewed tea and carried it to the porch, settling into the wicker chair where Tom and I used to watch sunsets. The neighborhood stirred. Kids pedaled bikes, their shouts bright and carefree. A young woman pushed a stroller, her face etched with exhaustion but lit with purpose. I envied her not for her age, but for the chance to begin again, to build something that mattered. At 67, I felt discarded, like a book read once and shelved. But as I sipped my tea, a stubborn thought flickered, faint but persistent. I wasn't finished. They could call me useless, but I wasn't. I had something left to give, just not to them. That thought was a lifeline, fragile but real. In the days that followed, I didn't call Ellen or text the kids. I let the silence stretch, and in its vastness, I began to hear my own voice again, not the mother, not the grandmother, but Ruth. The woman who'd once dreamed of seeing Paris, who'd danced with Tom under a harvest moon, who'd held dying hands in the ER and whispered comfort. I didn't know where this path would lead, but I knew I couldn't stay here waiting for them to see me. I had to find a way to matter again, to reclaim the woman I'd buried under years of giving. The spark grew, fed by memories of who I'd been before I let their needs define me. I started small, sorting through old letters, dusting off Tom's record player, playing the jazz he loved. Each act felt like a rebellion, a quiet claim on my own life. I walked to the park, sat by the pond, and watched the world move without me. A young mother there, juggling a toddler in a diaper bag, dropped her keys. I picked them up, and her grateful smile, brief but genuine, felt like the first kind touch I'd had in weeks. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind me I still had something to offer. Not to my family, but to someone somewhere. And that was enough to keep going. The days after my birthday stretched into weeks, each one heavy with a silence I hadn't invited, but couldn't escape. My phone stayed quiet. No texts from Ellen, no calls from Lily or Max, not even a cursory message to check if I was still breathing. I'd always been the one to reach out to mend the gaps in our family with a phone call or a plate of cookies. But now I let the quiet settle like dust on a forgotten shelf. It wasn't defiance. Not yet, just exhaustion. I was tired of chasing love that slipped through my fingers like water. I woke each morning in the same bed I'd shared with Tom, the left side still untouched, as if he might return to claim it. The house felt too big, its rooms echoing with memories I wasn't sure I wanted anymore. I'd walk past Ellen's old bedroom where her posters still hung, faded on the walls, and feel a pang so sharp it stole my breath. I'd linger by the mantel where photos of Lily and Max grinned from frames, gap-toothed smiles, from years when they'd climb into my lap and beg for stories. Those children were gone, replaced by strangers who saw me as a relic, a burden. I wondered if I'd imagined their love, if I'd built a story in my head to soften the truth. Loneliness is a peculiar thing. It doesn't just sit with you. It carves out pieces of you, leaving hollows where certainty used to be. I stopped cooking big meals, settling for toast or soup from a can. The kitchen, once alive with the clatter of pans and the chatter of family, felt like a museum to someone else's life. I avoided mirrors, afraid of the woman I'd see 67 with silver hair and eyes that carried too much grief. I'd given so much to them, poured my heart into their dreams, their futures. And now, standing in the wreckage of that giving, I didn't know who I was without them. But even in that gray haze, life has a way of nudging you forward. It was a Tuesday, I think, when I forced myself to leave the house. I needed milk, or maybe I just needed a reason to move. The corner store was a short walk past the park where I used to push Lily on the swings. The air was crisp, scented with autumn leaves, and I pulled my scarf tighter, feeling small against the world's indifference. Inside the store, the fluorescent lights buzzed, and I moved slowly, picking up a carton of milk, a loaf of bread. At the counter, a young woman with tired eyes and a name tag reading Clara rang me up. She couldn't have been more than 25, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, her nails chipped, but painted a defiant red. "You okay, ma'am?" She asked, her voice soft but curious. I must have looked as lost as I felt, standing there with my small basket, my hands trembling slightly. I nodded, forcing a smile, but she tilted her head, studying me. "Rough day, huh? I get it. My kid's sick, and I'm working doubles to cover the bills. Some days you just want to hide." Her honesty caught me off guard, a glimpse into a life I didn't know. I murmured something about hoping her child felt better, and she smiled a real smile, not the kind you give out of habit. "Thanks. You take care, okay?" That brief exchange stayed with me as I walked home, the milk cold against my arm. Clara didn't owe me her kindness, yet she'd offered it freely. It was a small thing, but it felt like a crack in the wall I'd built around myself. I started going to the store more often, not because I needed anything, but because I craved those fleeting moments of connection. Clara was usually there, and we'd chat about her son's ear infection, the rain that wouldn't stop the way coffee never tasted as good as it smelled. She didn't know about my family, about the word useless that echoed in my head, but she saw me. Not the grandmother, not the bank account, just Ruth, a woman with a story she didn't ask to hear. Those trips became a lifeline, a reason to comb my hair, to put on a sweater that wasn't stained with yesterday's soup. One day, Clara handed me a flyer for a community book club at the library. "You should come," she said, her eyes bright. "It's mostly old ladies arguing about romance novels, but it's fun. You'd fit right in." I laughed, the sound startling me. I hadn't laughed in weeks. I took the flyer, not promising anything, but her words lingered. Fit right in. When was the last time I'd felt that? I went to the book club the next week, my stomach knotted with nerves. The library smelled of old paper and polish, and a circle of women, most my age or older, sat around a table, their voices warm with debate. They were reading a novel about a woman who starts over after a divorce, and I listened, hesitant to speak. But then one woman, Margaret, with white curls and a sharp wit, turned to me. "Ruth, what do you think? Would you have left him or stayed?" I fumbled, unused to being asked my opinion, but I said I thought the woman was brave to choose herself. Margaret nodded like I'd said something profound, and the others chimed in their voices, weaving me into the conversation. I left that meeting lighter, clutching a borrowed copy of the book. It wasn't just the talk of novels or the tea they served in chipped mugs. It was the way those women looked at me like I had something worth hearing. I started going every week, and slowly I spoke more shared bits of myself. Not the hurt, not yet, but stories of my nursing days, of Tom's terrible puns, of the time I burned a Thanksgiving turkey and we ate pizza instead. They laughed, and I felt a piece of myself return, like a plant unfurling after a long winter. At home, I began to reclaim small spaces. I cleared the dining table, which had become a graveyard for unpaid bills and forgotten mail, and set it with a vase of daisies I'd bought on impulse. I played Tom's jazz records, letting the saxophone fill the house with something other than silence. One night, I pulled out an old sketchbook from my nursing school days when I dreamed of being an artist before life steered me elsewhere. My hands, stiff with age, traced clumsy lines, a flower, a horizon. It wasn't good, but it was mine, and that felt like a victory. These were small acts barely noticeable to anyone else, but they were mine. Each one was a step away from the woman who'd stood in the kitchen, hearing useless and believing it. I still carried the hurt, a bruise that throbbed when I thought of Ellen's laugh, Max's words, Lily's disdain. But I was beginning to see that their rejection didn't define me. I was more than their grandmother, their mother. I was Ruth, and I was still here, still capable of growth. One afternoon, walking back from the store, I passed the park again. The same young mother I'd seen weeks before was there, her toddler, now running wobbly laps around her. She looked even more tired, her coat frayed at the cuffs, but she was smiling, clapping as her son chased a leaf. I stopped watching them and felt a pull not to fix her life, but to honor that kind of resilience. I didn't know her story, but I knew it wasn't easy, and yet she was there showing up for her child. I wanted to be like that again, to show up for myself. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the sketchbook open, a cup of tea steaming beside me. I didn't draw. Instead, I wrote a single sentence on a blank page: I am not useless. It looked stark, almost silly, but it felt like a promise. Not to them, but to me. I didn't know what came next, but I knew I couldn't live in their shadow anymore. I had to find a way to stand in my own light, even if it meant walking alone. The weeks bled into months, and the silence from my family grew thicker, a wall I no longer tried to scale. I'd stopped expecting Ellen to call, stopped hoping for a text from Lily or Max that wasn't a thinly veiled request for money. Their absence was a wound that didn't bleed but ached, a dull, constant reminder of the word useless and the laughter that followed. I carried it like a stone in my pocket, heavy but familiar. Yet in that quiet, I was beginning to find something else, a space to rebuild, not for them, but for me. Mornings were the hardest. I'd wake to the same empty house, the same creak of the floorboards under my feet. The bed still felt too big without Tom his side, untouched, the pillow flat from years of waiting. I'd make coffee, sit by the window, and watch the world stir, neighbors walking, dogs, joggers in bright sneakers, the young mother from the park sometimes hurrying past with her stroller. Life moved on, and I was still here trying to remember what it felt like to belong to it. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was just lost, a woman untethered from the role that had defined her for decades. I stopped setting the table for 4, stopped buying the snacks Max loved, or the yogurt Lily would eat. The fridge grew sparse, reflecting the hollowness I felt. I'd wander the house, touching relics of the past. Tom's fishing hat on the coat rack, Ellen's childhood drawings tucked in a drawer, the rocking chair where I'd nursed her through colic. Each one stung a reminder of what I'd poured into them, only to be discarded. I'd look at my hands lined and spotted with age and wonder when they'd stopped being enough, when I'd stopped being enough. But even in that fog, small moments broke through like sunlight through a cracked shutter. My walks to the corner store became a ritual, not just for milk or bread, but for Clara's smile, her quick stories about her son Jamal, or her complaints about the store's broken AC. She was a single mother, I learned, working 2 jobs to keep the lights on. Her life was a tightrope, yet she walked it with a grit I admired. One day, she slipped a chocolate bar into my bag as I paid. On the house, she said, winking, "You look like you need a treat." I laughed, startled by the sound, and thanked her. That chocolate sat on my counter for days, not because I didn't want it, but because it felt like a gift I didn't deserve. Clara's kindness nudged me further into the world. I kept going to the book club at the library where Margaret and the others welcomed me like I'd always been there. We were reading a novel about a woman who rebuilds her life after losing everything, and I found myself underlining passages, words about resilience and self-worth that felt like messages meant for me. I spoke up more, sharing stories of my nursing days, how I'd once talked a panicked mother through her child's seizure, or the night I held a dying man's hand until his last breath. The women listened, their eyes warm, and I felt seen not as a grandmother or a widow, but as Ruth, a woman with a history worth hearing. Those meetings gave me courage to try other things. I signed up for a pottery class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for. My first attempts were lumpy, misshapen bowls, but the feel of clay under my fingers, the hum of the wheel was grounding. The instructor, a quiet man named Leo, praised my persistence, saying I had a good eye for form. I didn't believe him, but I kept going, showing up each week to shape something new. It wasn't about the pots. It was about creating, about proving to myself I could still make something from nothing. At home, I started to carve out space for myself. I boxed up some of Ellen's old things, not with anger, but with a need to breathe. I moved Tom's armchair to the window where I could read in the morning light. I bought a small radio and tuned it to a jazz station, letting Ella Fitzgerald's voice fill the rooms. One evening, I found an old journal from my 20s, filled with dreams I'd forgotten, traveling to Italy, learning to paint, opening a little cafe. I'd laughed at them then, thinking life had other plans. But now, reading them at 67, I felt a stirring, a whisper that maybe it wasn't too late. These small acts were my rebellion, quiet but fierce. I wasn't ready to confront my family, wasn't sure I ever would be. But I was done letting their words define me. I started writing in that journal again, not plans, but truths. I am not useless. I wrote one night the words, shaky but bold. I am enough. I didn't fully believe it, but writing it felt like planting a seed, something that might grow if I tended it. One afternoon, I saw the young mother from the park again. She was at the playground, her son toddling after a butterfly, her face a mix of exhaustion and love. I don't know why, but I walked over, my heart pounding. "He's beautiful," I said, nodding at her boy. She looked startled, then smiled. "Thanks. He's a handful, but he's my world." Her name was Tessa, she told me, and she was raising him alone, working nights as a cleaner. We talked for a few minutes about nothing and everything, diapers, sleepless nights, the way kids make you laugh and cry in the same breath. When I left, she called after me. "Come back sometime, okay?" I nodded, my throat tight. It was a small thing, but it felt like an invitation to exist again. That encounter stayed with me, a reminder of the strength it takes to keep going when the world feels heavy. Tessa didn't know my story, didn't know about the grandchildren who called me useless, or the daughter who laughed at my pain. But she'd shared a piece of her life, and it made me want to share mine, not with my family, but with someone who might value it. I started volunteering at the library, helping with the children's reading hour. The kids were loud, chaotic, but their joy was contagious. I'd read them stories, my voice steady, and they'd listen, their eyes wide, like I was someone who mattered. One girl, a shy 6-year-old named Mia, drew me a picture of a flower. I pinned it to my fridge next to Claire's chocolate wrapper, a gallery of small kindnesses. These moments weren't grand, but they were building something inside me, a foundation fragile, but real. I still carried the hurt, the memory of that birthday night like a scar, but I was learning to live around it, to fill the hollows with new things. I wasn't ready to forgive Ellen, or the kids, wasn't sure I ever would be. But I was starting to forgive myself for believing I was only as valuable as what I gave them. I was Ruth, and I was finding my way back to her one small step at a time. One night, I sat at the kitchen table, my journal open, a mug of chamomile tea steaming beside me. I wrote about Tessa, about the library kids, about the lumpy bowl I'd made in pottery class. Then on a whim, I wrote something else. I want to do something that matters, something they can't take away. I didn't know what it meant, not yet, but it felt like a vow, a promise to the woman I was becoming. I closed the journal, looked at Mia's flower on the fridge, and felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to carry me forward into a future I was beginning to shape for myself. The winter came wrapping the house in a chill that seeped into my bones, but I was no longer content to sit in its shadow. The silence from Ellen and the kids had hardened into a fact, like the frost on my windows, cold, unyielding, but not my entire world anymore. I'd begun to see the outlines of a life that wasn't tethered to their approval, a life where I could be Ruth again, not just the grandmother they'd dismissed. The word useless still lingered a ghost that whispered in quiet moments, but I was learning to drown it out with the sound of my own voice, my own choices. I started waking earlier not out of restlessness, but because I wanted the day. I'd brew coffee, sit by the window with Tom's old jazz records playing low, and watch the sunrise paint the sky in pinks and golds. It felt like a gift those mornings, a reminder that the world kept turning and I could turn with it. I filled my journal with more than just affirmations, now sketches of flowers, snippets of poetry, ideas that felt foolish, but mine. I wrote about wanting to travel to see the canals of Venice or the cliffs of Ireland. I wrote about opening a space, maybe a community garden, where people like Tessa could rest. They were dreams, not plans, but they gave me something to hold on to. The book club at the library became my anchor. Margaret and the others had become friends, their laughter and stories, a balm to the loneliness I'd carried. We'd moved on to a novel about a woman who starts a bakery after her children leave home, and I found myself drawn to her quiet defiance, her refusal to let loss define her. One meeting, I admitted I'd always wanted to bake for others, not just my family. Margaret raised her glass of tea and said, "Then do it, Ruth. You don't need permission." Her words stuck a challenge I couldn't shake. I started small baking muffins for the book club blueberry with a crumble top, the kind Tom used to steal from the counter. The women raved, and for the first time in months, I felt pride not for what I'd given someone else, but for what I'd created. I began bringing cookies to the library's reading hour, watching the kids' faces light up as they munched. Mia, the shy girl who'd drawn me the flower, hugged me one day, her small arms tight around my waist. "You make the best cookies, Miss Ruth," she said. I smiled my throat tight and realized I was building something new, a legacy not of money but of moments. My pottery class was another quiet victory. My bowls were still uneven, but I'd made a vase simple but sturdy and painted it a deep green. Leo, the instructor, called it honest, and I liked that. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, born from my hands and my will. I brought it home, filled it with daisies, and set it on the kitchen table. It felt like a statement, a claim on the space I'd let my family's absence hollow out. I started clearing more of their traces, not with anger, but with purpose. I packed away Lily's old dolls, Max's forgotten soccer trophies, Ellen's high school yearbooks. I wasn't erasing them. I was making room for me. One afternoon, I found a letter from Tom tucked in a box of old papers. It was from our early years when he'd been away for work, and it was full of his quiet love promises to dance with me under every moon, to build a life where I'd always feel safe. I sat on the floor, tears streaming down my face, not just for him, but for the woman I'd been the one who'd believed in those promises. I hadn't felt safe in years, not since he died, not since my family turned me into a stranger. But reading his words, I wanted to feel that way again, not for them, but for myself. That letter sparked something. I called a lawyer the next day, a woman named Susan I'd met through the book club. She was sharp kind and didn't treat me like a frail old lady. I asked about my estate, the $2 million Tom and I had saved the house that held our life's work. I'd always assumed it would go to Ellen, to the kids, because that's what mothers do. But now, the thought of them inheriting it after their laughter, their dismissal felt like a betrayal of everything I'd built. Susan listened, her eyes steady, and said, "Ruth, it's your life. You decide what it means." She didn't push, just laid out options, trusts, donations, wills. I left her office with a folder of papers and a seed of an idea too fragile to name. I didn't tell anyone, not even Margaret or Clara. But I started researching late at night when the house was quiet. I read about scholarship funds, about single mothers like Tessa and Clara women who fought every day to give their kids a chance. I found a local organization that supported women going back to school, women who'd been left behind by circumstance, but not by ambition. Their stories hit me hard. Women my age, younger, older, all clawing their way towards something better. I saw myself in them, not in their struggles, but in their refusal to give up. I wanted to help not out of pity, but out of respect. I kept volunteering at the library reading to the kids and started helping with their fundraiser, a book sale to buy new computers. I organized the tables, priced the paperbacks, and felt a purpose I hadn't known in years. Tessa came one day, her son in tow, and bought a worn copy of a children's book. We talked longer this time about her night shifts, her dream of becoming a nurse. "Like you were," she said. And I blinked, surprised she'd remembered. I gave her a stack of my old nursing textbooks, ones I'd kept for no reason until now. Her gratitude, fierce and unpolished, was a mirror to my own growing strength. These choices, baking, potting, volunteering, researching, were threads weaving a new version of me. I wasn't the woman who'd stood in the kitchen hearing her family's scorn. I was someone who could create, who could give, who could choose. I started wearing Tom's old watch, the leather band, worn but warm against my wrist. It ticked softly, a reminder of time I still had time I could use. I planted herbs in the backyard, basil, rosemary, time my hands in the dirt, grounding me to the earth, to myself. One evening, Susan called. She'd drafted some documents options for redirecting my estate. I didn't sign anything yet, but I asked her to look into the scholarship fund to see how I could make it real. It wasn't revenge, though. The thought of Ellen's face, of Greg's smug grin fading, flickered in my mind. It was justice not for them, but for me. I wanted my life to mean something, to leave a mark that wasn't tied to people who saw me as a means to an end. I went to bed that night with Tom's letter on my nightstand, his words a quiet anthem. I wasn't ready to tell the world, wasn't ready to face my family, but I was ready to keep growing, to keep choosing myself. I looked at the vase on the table, the herbs sprouting in the yard, the journal filled with my dreams, and I felt a quiet pride. I was Ruth, and I was enough not because they said so, but because I was proving it one small, stubborn step at a time. Spring arrived, tentative at first, with buds on the trees and a softness in the air that felt like permission to keep going. The house no longer felt like a tomb. It was becoming a sanctuary, each corner marked by my choices. The green vase on the table, the herbs thriving in the backyard, Tom's watch ticking on my wrist. The silence from Ellen, Lily, and Max was still there, a shadow that darkened quiet moments, but I was learning to step out of its reach. I wasn't just surviving their rejection. I was building something new, something that belonged to me alone. My days took on a rhythm, not the frantic pace of my nursing years, or the endless giving of motherhood, but a steady cadence of purpose. I'd wake with the dawn brew tea and sit with my journal writing not just dreams, but plans. The idea of the scholarship fund had taken root, growing from a spark into a vision I could almost touch. I'd spent hours with Susan the lawyer poring over details, how to structure the fund, how to ensure it reached women like Tessa and Clara, women who fought against the odds. It wasn't about the money itself, though $2 million was no small thing. It was about what it could do, the doors it could open for someone else's future. Each meeting with Susan left me lighter, as if I were shedding the weight of my family's expectations. I didn't tell anyone, not yet. The secrecy felt sacred, a promise I was keeping to myself. But I carried it like a flame, warming the parts of me that had gone cold on my birthday. I kept volunteering at the library where the children's reading hour had become my joy. The kids, especially Mia, greeted me with shouts and hugs, their small hands tugging me to read one more story. I'd bake for them, too, oatmeal cookies, lemon bars, watching their faces light up as they ate. Mia gave me another drawing, this one, of me reading to a circle of stick-figure kids. I framed it, hung it in the living room where Ellen's wedding photo used to be. It wasn't a replacement, not exactly, but it was a choice to honor what nourished me now. The pottery class was another anchor. My hands were steadier now, shaping clay into bowls and mugs that weren't perfect, but held a quiet beauty. Leo, the instructor, said I had a knack for texture, and I started experimenting carving patterns into the clay swirls, leaves, waves. One day, I made a small dish, glazed it a deep blue, and gave it to Clara at the store. She held it like it was precious, her eyes bright. "Ruth, this is gorgeous. You're an artist." I laughed, brushing it off, but her words settled in me a reminder that I could create something worth keeping. Clara and I had grown closer, our chats at the store stretching longer. She'd tell me about Jamal's first words, her struggles to afford daycare, her dream of going to college someday. I never mentioned the scholarship fund, but her stories fueled it, giving it shape. One day she asked about my family, her voice gentle but curious. I hesitated, the memory of that birthday night still sharp, but I told her a piece of it, how I'd felt invisible, how I was trying to find myself again. She listened, her hand still on the counter, and said, "You're not invisible to me, Ruth. You're like a lighthouse, steady even when the storm's bad." I didn't cry, but I carried her words home, wrote them in my journal, let them sink deep. The book club was another refuge. We were reading a novel about a woman who forgives her estranged daughter, and the discussion turned heated. Margaret argued forgiveness was overrated, that some betrayals cut too deep. I stayed quiet, thinking of Ellen's laugh, Max's words, Lily's disdain. I wasn't ready to forgive, didn't know if I ever would be, but I spoke up, saying I thought the woman in the book was stronger for choosing herself, not for reconciling. The others nodded, and Margaret squeezed my hand. "You're a wise one, Ruth," she said. I felt a swell of pride, not for their approval, but for trusting my own voice. I started taking longer walks, not just to the store or park, but through the town past the old diner where Tom and I used to share fries, the church where Ellen was baptized. I'd sit by the river sometimes, watching the water move steady and unhurried. One day, I saw Tessa there, her son splashing in the shallows. We talked again about her job, her hopes, the way motherhood both broke and remade her. I told her about my nursing days, how I'd loved helping people heal. She smiled, said, "You're still helping, Ruth. You just don't see it." Her words echoed Clara's, and I began to believe them, not fully, but enough to keep going. The scholarship fund was becoming real. Susan had connected me with the organization, and I'd met their director, a woman named Diane, who'd raised 3 kids alone while earning a degree. She talked about the women they served, mothers working double shifts, studying at night, fighting for their kids' futures. I told her I wanted to fund scholarships, not just a one-time gift, but something lasting. She listened, her eyes sharp with respect, and said, "This could change lives, Ruth. You're giving them a chance to breathe." We worked out the details anonymously for now. I didn't want fanfare, didn't want my family to know. This was mine, a piece of my heart I was giving to strangers who'd never call me useless. I sold some stocks, moved money into the fund, and kept the house in my name. Susan suggested I could sell it too, start fresh somewhere new, but I wasn't ready. The house was Tom's and mine, the place where we dreamed and grieved and loved. I wasn't giving it up, not yet, but I was rewriting its story, filling it with my herbs, my pottery, my journal. I planted a rose bush in the yard, one Tom had always wanted. It was small, thorny, but it bloomed a quiet defiance against the winter that had tried to claim me. One night, I found an old photo of myself from my nursing days, young in scrubs, smiling with a patient. I looked strong, alive, like someone who knew her worth. I pinned it to the fridge next to Mia's drawing, Clara's dish, Tessa's borrowed textbooks. It was a reminder of who I'd been, who I was becoming. I wasn't the woman who'd stood in the kitchen hearing her family's scorn. I was Ruth, and I was choosing myself not with anger, but with a steady, growing strength. I knew the day would come when I'd face them, Ellen, Greg, the kids, not to beg for their love, but to show them who I was without them. The scholarship fund was nearly ready, the papers waiting for my signature. I didn't know how they'd react, didn't care as much as I once would have. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about me, about the women I'd help, about the life I was building from the ashes of their betrayal. I went to bed that night with Tom's watch on my wrist, the rosebush blooming outside and a quiet certainty in my chest. I was enough, and I was just beginning. The summer sun spilled through my kitchen window, warming the green vase on the table and casting shadows that danced with the breeze. I was 67, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was living, not just enduring. The silence from Ellen, Lily, and Max had become a distant hum, no longer the loudest sound in my life. I'd filled the hollows they left with my own rhythm pottery, volunteering the scholarship fund that was now more than a dream, but a reality I'd shaped with my own hands. The word useless still stung when I let it, but I was learning to let it pass like a cloud that couldn't hold its rain. My days were full not with the chaos of motherhood or the demands of family, but with choices that felt like mine. I'd wake early, tend to the rosebush and herbs in the backyard, their growth a mirror to my own. I'd write in my journal no longer just dreams or affirmations, but reflections on what I was building. The scholarship fund was finalized, the papers signed in Susan's office under the hum of a ceiling fan. I'd named it the Horizon Fund, a nod to the dreams I'd once scribbled in my 20s, and to the women it would help single mothers like Tessa and Clara, who deserved a chance to reach their own horizons. The $2 million was gone from my account, redirected to a legacy that felt truer than anything I'd ever given my family. I kept it secret not out of fear, but because it was mine to hold until I was ready. Susan had been meticulous, ensuring the donation was anonymous, the house still in my name, my financial independence intact. I'd sold more stocks, paid off the last of the mortgage, and kept enough to live simply but well. The house, with its creaky floors and memories of Tom, was no longer a weight. It was my haven filled with my pottery, my books, the jazz records that played softly as I cooked. I'd started painting again, small canvases of flowers and rivers, nothing grand, but each stroke was a reclaiming of the girl who'd once dreamed of art. The library was my second home. I'd taken on more with the children's program, not just reading, but helping plan events, a summer book fair, a storytelling workshop. The kids, especially Mia, were my light. She'd started calling me Miss Ruthie. Her drawings, now a stack I kept in a drawer, each one a reminder that I could still matter to someone. I baked for them weekly, experimenting with recipes, lavender shortbread cinnamon rolls that left the library smelling like a bakery. Parents thanked me their gratitude, small but real, and I felt a pride I hadn't known in years, not for their thanks, but for the act of giving on my terms. Clara and I had become friends, our talks at the store, a ritual I cherished. She'd started taking night classes, a step toward her college dream, and I'd quietly slipped her some of my old nursing notes, saying they were cluttering my shelves. She hugged me, her arms fierce, and said, "Ruth, you're like my fairy godmother." I laughed, but her words stayed with me, a reminder that kindness could ripple without expectation. I saw Tessa, too, at the park or the library book sale, her son now chattering in full sentences. She'd started studying for a nursing entrance exam, using the textbooks I'd given her. "You inspired me," she said one day, and I blinked back tears, not because I felt heroic, but because I saw my strength reflected in her. The book club was a constant Margaret, and the others a circle of warmth. We were reading a novel about a woman who leaves her old life behind, and I spoke up more, sharing thoughts I'd once kept locked away. One night, I admitted I'd done something big, something I wasn't ready to share. Margaret raised an eyebrow, but didn't pry, just said, "Whatever it is, Ruth, it's got you glowing. That's enough for now." I smiled, feeling the truth of it. I was glowing not with youth or beauty, but with a quiet fire I'd stoked myself. I'd started wearing brighter clothes, scarves, and red sweaters in teal colors I'd shied away from after Tom died. I'd cut my hair shorter, letting the silver shine, and bought a pair of boots that made me feel bold. Tom's watch stayed on my wrist, its ticking a steady companion, but I added a bracelet from the pottery class, a simple clay bead I'd made myself. These were small things, but they were declarations, a way of saying I was here, still growing, still Ruth. One afternoon, I visited the organization running the Horizon Fund. Diane, the director, showed me letters from the first recipients, women who'd enrolled in college, bought textbooks, paid for childcare so they could study. One letter from a mother named Aisha thanked the anonymous donor for giving her a chance to become a teacher. I read it in Diane's office, my hands trembling, and felt a joy so deep it hurt. This was what my life could mean, not a house or a bank account for a family who scorned me, but a bridge for women who'd never call me useless. I knew the time was coming to face Ellen and the kids. Not because I needed their approval, but because I needed to close the door on their version of me. I'd heard from a neighbor that Ellen had been asking about me, her tone sharp, wondering why I hadn't called. Greg had mentioned my savings at a barbecue, assuming they were his to inherit. The kids, I heard, were planning a trip to Europe, expecting Grandma's money to fund it. Their greed was a dull ache, but it no longer surprised me. I wasn't ready to confront them, but I was preparing, gathering my strength, like a storm building on the horizon. I started writing a letter, not to send, but to clarify my thoughts. It was addressed to them, Ellen, Greg, Lily, Max, but it was for me a way to name the hurt and let it go. I wrote about that birthday, the laughter, the word useless. I wrote about the years I'd given them, the love I'd poured into their lives, the money I'd spent on their cars, their vacations, their dreams. I wrote about the scholarship fund, though I didn't name it, saying only that I'd given my heart to something that saw me. The letter was long, raw, and I burned it in the backyard, watching the ashes rise. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was freedom, a release of the weight I'd carried. I planted another rosebush that day next to the first, its buds a soft pink. It was a symbol like the vase, the watch, the paintings, a marker of the life I was building. I didn't need their love to be whole. I had Clara's friendship, Tessa's gratitude, Mia's drawings, Margaret's respect. I had the women of the Horizon Fund, strangers who'd never know my name, but would carry my legacy. I had myself, and that was enough. One evening I sat on the porch, Tom's jazz playing through the open window, a canvas drying in the kitchen. I looked at the rose bushes, the herbs, the life I'd grown from the dirt of their betrayal. I wasn't the woman who'd stood in the kitchen broken by their words. I was Ruth, and I was ready not to fight, but to stand in my truth. The letter I'd burned was a rehearsal. The real one was coming not on paper, but in a moment I'd choose. I sipped my tea, felt the sun on my face, and knew I was enough not because they said so, but because I'd proven it one quiet, stubborn choice at a time. The air in the dining room was thick with the scent of roasted chicken and rosemary, a warmth that should have felt like home, but instead carried a tension I could taste. It was late August, and I'd invited Ellen, Greg, Lily, and Max for dinner, the first time I'd seen them since that birthday night nearly a year ago. The table was set with the good china, the gold-rimmed plates Tom and I had cherished. But this wasn't a gesture of reconciliation. It was a stage carefully arranged for a truth I'd been building toward, a moment when I'd rewrite the story they'd cast me in. I was Ruth 67, and I was no longer invisible. The past months had solidified something in me, a strength I hadn't known I could claim. The Horizon Fund was thriving, its first scholarships awarded to women whose letters of gratitude I kept in a drawer, each one a testament to a legacy I'd chosen. My house was alive again, filled with my pottery, my paintings, the rose bushes blooming in the yard. Clara, Tessa, Mia, and the book club women had become my family not by blood, but by the kind of love that sees you whole. I'd worn Tom's watch every day, its ticking a reminder of the time I still had, and I'd added a necklace, a small silver pendant, shaped like a horizon, a gift from Margaret to mark my new chapter. I was ready not for their approval, but to show them who I was without them. They arrived on time, which surprised me. Ellen's smile was tight, her eyes scanning the house as if checking for changes. Greg carried a bottle of cheap wine, his grin too wide like he was selling something. Lily and Max trailed behind their phones in hand, their faces bored but expectant. I greeted them with a calm. I didn't feel my heart steady, but my hands trembling slightly as I took their coats. "It's been a while," I said, my voice even. Ellen nodded, muttering about their busy schedules, while Greg clapped my shoulder, saying, "Good to see you, Ruth." "Place looks the same." It didn't not to me, but I let it pass. Dinner was civil, a performance of normalcy. I served the food: chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans I'd grown myself, and they ate their conversations circling their lives. Greg's new business venture, Ellen's promotion, Lily's college applications, Max's soccer tournament. They didn't ask about me, not really, though. Ellen mentioned my retirement with a tone that implied I'd faded into irrelevance. I smiled, nodded, and let them talk my mind on the envelope in my pocket, its weight both anchor and wings. I'd written the letter weeks ago after burning the first one. This wasn't a rant or a plea. It was a declaration, simple and clear, stating what I'd done and why. I'd rehearsed this moment in my head, imagining their faces, their voices, but now with them here, it felt less like a confrontation and more like a release. I wasn't here to fight. I was here to be seen, to stand in the truth I'd built from the ashes of their betrayal. As we finished dessert lemon cake, the same I'd made for that birthday, though none of them noticed, I cleared my throat. The room fell quiet, their eyes on me, some curious, some impatient. I pulled the envelope from my pocket, its edges worn from my touch, and set it on the table. "I have something to share." I said, my voice steady, though my heart raced. "It's important, and I'd like you to listen." Ellen frowned, her fork pausing. Greg leaned back, his smirk fading. Lily and Max glanced up from their phones, sensing a shift. I opened the envelope, unfolded the letter, and began to read, my voice clear, each word a step into the light. "I turned 67 last year," I began. "I spent that day hoping for a moment with you, a sign that I mattered. Instead, I heard you call me useless, Max, and you, Lily, agreed. Ellen, you laughed, and Greg, you didn't care enough to stop it. I stood in the kitchen washing dishes while you decided I was nothing but a bank account." Their faces changed. Ellen's eyes widened. Max flushed. Lily looked away. Greg shifted uncomfortably. I kept going, my voice unwavering. "I've spent my life giving to you," I said. "I paid for your cars, your vacations, your braces, your dreams. I thought that's what love was, giving until I had nothing left. But you took it for granted, saw me as a means to an end. So I made a choice. The $2 million I'd saved the estate you assumed was yours. It's gone. I donated it to a scholarship fund for single mothers, women who fight every day for their children, who'd never call someone useless for loving them." The room was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your skin. Ellen's mouth opened, but no sound came. Greg's face reddened, his hands clenching. Lily stared at the table, her phone forgotten. Max's eyes darted to his mother as if waiting for her to fix this. I didn't stop. "The house is still mine," I said. "I've paid it off and I'll live here as long as I choose. But you should know I've been funding your lives for years. The vacations, the car payments, the credit card bills I quietly covered. That ends now. You're on your own, not because I hate you, but because I love myself enough to stop being your ATM." I folded the letter, set it down, and looked at them. Ellen's voice broke the silence, sharp and trembling. "Mom, how could you? That was our future." Greg cut in, his tone accusing. "You can't just give away what's ours? We're family." Lily whispered, "Grandma." Why, Max said nothing, his face pale. I let their words crash against me, but they didn't break me. "I'm not your future," I said, my voice soft but firm. "I'm my own. You made it clear I was nothing to you but money. So I gave that money to people who'll value what it can do. I'm not useless. I'm Ruth, and I've built something beautiful without you." The air shifted, their shock turning to panic. Ellen's eyes filled with tears, but I saw calculation in them, not regret. Greg sputtered about lawyers about fighting the decision. Lily and Max looked lost, their entitlement crumbling. I stood my chair scraping the floor and smiled, not with malice, but with a serenity I'd earned. "You can leave now," I said. "The dishes can wait." They didn't move at first, stunned, but I walked to the door and opened it, the summer air warm against my face. Slowly they gathered their things, their voices low, urgent, already planning how to salvage what they'd lost. I watched them go their car, pulling away, and felt no triumph, only peace. I'd spoken my truth, not for their sake, but for mine. I was free not of them, but of the weight of their expectations. I returned to the table, the letter still there, the plates untouched. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat in Tom's armchair, and listened to the quiet. The rose bushes outside bloomed, the pendant around my neck glinted, and I knew I'd done more than shift power. I'd reclaimed myself, not with anger, but with a dignity they couldn't touch. The days following that dinner settled into a gentle cadence, like the rustle of leaves finding their place after a storm. The house, once heavy with the echoes of my family's rejection, now breathed with a lightness I'd cultivated. I'd stood before Ellen, Greg, Lily, and Max, my voice steady, as I read the letter that laid bare their betrayal and my choice to give away the $2 million they'd counted on. Their faces stunned, angry, desperate, were a fleeting image, no longer the center of my world. I felt no vindictive thrill, no need to revel in their loss. Instead, I felt complete, as if I'd gathered the fragments of myself I'd scattered for their sake and made them whole again. I was Ruth, 67, and I was at peace, not because they saw my worth, but because I did. The Horizon Fund. My quiet rebellion was flourishing, its roots spreading further than I dared hope. Diane, the director, sent me updates, careful to keep my anonymity intact. The stories came in letters nameless but vivid, each one a spark in the darkness I'd once lived in. A woman named Sophia had enrolled in nursing school, her children now in after-school programs funded by the scholarships. Another named Amara was studying to become a social worker. Her tuition covered her dreams, no longer deferred. I kept these letters in a carved wooden box beside Tom's old love notes, a testament that my life's work could build something enduring, something no one could call useless. Each word from those women was a thread in a legacy I'd chosen, one that stretched beyond the family who discarded me. My days were simple, woven with purpose, that felt like mine. I still volunteered at the library where the children's reading hour remained my sanctuary. Mia and the other kids greeted me with squeals, their small hands pulling me to share one more book. I baked for them chocolate chip cookies, apple tarts, watching their eyes light up as they ate their joy, a reminder that giving could be joy, not obligation. Mia gave me another drawing, a crayon sketch of me with a book and a smile, and I hung it in the living room next to the green vase I'd made in pottery class. It wasn't about replacing my family, it was about honoring what fed my soul. My pottery had become a language of its own. My hands, once unsteady, now shaped mugs and plates with a confidence I hadn't known I could reclaim. I glazed them in blues and golds, carving patterns of stars and vines, and gave them to Clara, Tessa, and Margaret, each piece a small piece of me. Clara, now juggling college classes and motherhood, displayed my blue dish on her counter, calling it her lucky charm. Tessa, who'd passed her nursing exam, kept a mug at her study desk, a reminder, she said, of the woman who'd believed in her. I painted, too, my canvases alive with roses, rivers, and horizons, each one a step toward the artist I'd once dreamed of being. The rose bushes in the yard bloomed with a fierceness that matched my own, their petals, a quiet anthem of survival. Clara and I grew closer, our talks at the store now spilling into lunches at a nearby cafe. She'd started her first semester, her voice bright with pride as she shared stories of late-night studying and Jamal's new words. "You showed me I could do this, Ruth," she said, her hand squeezing mine. I didn't tell her about the fund, but her strength fueled my belief in it, a silent promise that it would reach women like her. Tessa and I met often at the park or my kitchen, where we'd sip tea while her son played with blocks. She was preparing for nursing school, her determination a mirror to the Ruth I'd been in my 20s. "You're my role model," she told me, and I smiled, saying she was hers. But her words rooted deep proof that I could inspire without losing myself. The book club was my Hearth Margaret and the women my chosen kin. We read a novel about a woman who finds solace after betrayal, and I shared more of my journey, not the fund's details, but the arc from that birthday to now. I spoke of the pain, the rebuilding, the discovery that I could be enough without my family's love. Margaret called me a quiet warrior, her eyes warm, and the others nodded their stories, weaving with mine. I felt seen not as a grandmother or widow, but as Ruth, a woman whose voice mattered. I heard whispers about Ellen and the kids through neighbors Greg's business, faltering their lavish lifestyle, fraying without my checks. Ellen had asked a friend why I'd changed her tone, more annoyed than remorseful. Lily and Max, I heard, were upset about their canceled Europe trip, blaming me for their ruined summer. I felt a pang not of guilt, but of sorrow for what we'd lost, not just their love, but the chance to be a family that valued each other. I didn't hate them, didn't wish them ill. I'd released the need for their approval, and with it the weight of their judgment. Forgiveness wasn't mine to offer yet, and I was at ease with that. I'd forgiven myself for believing my worth lay in their hands, for letting useless define me. That was the absolution I needed. One crisp morning, I walked to the river, the air sharp with the promise of autumn. I sat on a bench watching the water flow steady and unhurried. A young mother pushed a stroller nearby, her face weary but resolute, and I thought of the women the fund would lift, women I'd never meet, but whose futures I'd shaped. I wore Tom's watch, the horizon pendant Margaret gave me, and a scarf in vibrant red colors that claimed my place in the world. I was no longer unseen, not to Clara, Tessa Mia, or myself. I was Ruth, and I was whole. That afternoon, I did something I'd planned for months. In the backyard, I planted a dogwood tree, its slender branches bare but full of promise. It was a ritual, like the rose bushes, the pottery, the paintings, a marker of the life I'd grown from the soil of their betrayal. At its roots, I buried a small tin holding a copy of the Horizon Fund's first letter, a photo of me from my nursing days smiling with purpose, and a note, for Ruth, who chose to thrive. It was for me a silent vow to keep blooming, to keep giving, to keep being. As dusk fell, I sat on the porch, Tom's jazz drifting through the open window, a mug of chamomile tea warming my hands. The dogwood stood tall, its silhouette, a quiet hope against the fading sky. I thought of you watching this, perhaps carrying your own scars, feeling overlooked or discarded. I want you to hear this, to hold it close. Your value isn't in who loves you back, but in how you choose to honor your own heart. Plant your tree, bake your bread, paint your sky, give to those who see your light. You are enough, not because they say so, but because you are. And that's a truth no one can take. I lifted my mug to the stars, to Tom, to the women of the Horizon Fund, to the Ruth I'd become. The night was clear, the stars bright, and I smiled knowing I was part of their glow.